The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in May of 1882, announcing that Miriam Jenkins would be arriving in Pueblo, Colorado by the end of the week, and ranch hand Russell Lawton felt his stomach drop to his boots when he realized what he had done in a moment of whiskey-fueled loneliness 3 months prior. He stood in the dusty telegraph office, reading and rereading the words as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air drifting down from the Rockies. Behind him, old Pete Morrison cleared his throat, waiting for Russell to either pay or vacate the premises. Russell fumbled for a coin, dropped it on the counter, and walked out into the bright Colorado sunshine, the telegram crumpling in his fist. The whole mess had started back in February when the snow lay thick on the ground and the winter stretched endlessly before them. Russell had been working at the Double K Ranch for 5 years, saving every penny he could spare, and had finally scraped together enough to buy a small parcel of land just north of Pueblo. The land was his, 160 acres of prairie and possibility, but the house he had built was small and empty. And at 24 years old, Russell was tired of eating his own cooking and talking only to his horse. His fellow ranch hand, Danny Wheeler, had suggested the mail-order bride service almost as a joke, but after several whiskeys at the saloon that night, Russell had penned a letter. He had tried to be honest, describing himself as a working man with his own land, decent prospects, and a strong back. He had mentioned that he was looking for a practical woman who did not mind hard work and simple living. He had not expected a response, but Miriam Jenkins had written back. Her letters were brief but well written, her penmanship neat and controlled. She was 22, orphaned, and working in a textile mill in Massachusetts. She wanted a fresh start and a husband who would treat her with respect. She asked surprisingly few questions about his finances or prospects, which Russell found both refreshing and slightly worrying. In her third letter, she had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she loved wildflowers and had always dreamed of seeing them growing freely across open land. That single sentence had struck something deep in Russell's chest. He pictured her, this unknown woman, trapped in a gray factory city dreaming of wildflowers. He had written back immediately, assuring her that Colorado had wildflowers aplenty in the spring and summer. He had proposed marriage, she had accepted, and now she was coming. Russell rode back to his land, his mind churning. The house was finished but sparse. He had built it himself over the past 2 years, working every spare moment. It had 2 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen and a separate bedroom. The walls were solid, the roof did not leak, and he had even installed glass windows, a luxury he had saved for months to afford. But it was empty of any softness, any sign that a woman might live there comfortably. He spent the next 3 days in a frenzy of preparation. He bought fabric in town and fashioned rough curtains, his stitches uneven but functional. He scrubbed the floors until his knuckles were raw. He brought in wildflowers from the surrounding prairie and put them in a jar on the table, but they wilted within hours, and he threw them out in frustration. He purchased a proper bed frame to replace the simple cot he had been using, nearly depleting his savings in the process. On Friday morning, he bathed in the creek, shaved carefully, and put on his only good shirt. He rode into Pueblo and waited at the train station, his hat in his hands, watching the eastern horizon for the first sign of smoke. The train arrived precisely at noon, belching steam and cinders as it ground to a halt. Russell watched as passengers began to disembark, his heart hammering against his ribs. Businessmen in suits, families with squalling children, miners heading for the mountains. And then he saw her. Miriam Jenkins stepped down from the train car with careful precision, one gloved hand holding her skirts clear of the steps, the other clutching a worn carpetbag. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet. Her dress was gray and practical, the fabric worn but clean. She looked around the platform with wide eyes, her face pale with either exhaustion or fear. Russell could not tell which. He approached slowly, clearing his throat. "Miss Jenkins." She turned to him, and he saw that her eyes were a startling green, the color of new grass after rain. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his height, his sun-weathered face, his work-roughened hands. "Mr. Lawton." "Yes, madam, Russell Lawton. Welcome to Pueblo." The words felt stiff and formal on his tongue. "Thank you." Her voice was soft, with the clipped accent of New England. She looked tired, deep shadows beneath her eyes. "It was a long journey." "I imagine so. Do you have other luggage?" "Just this." She lifted the carpetbag slightly. Everything she owned in the world, Russell realized, fit into one small bag. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Russell gestured toward his horse. "I have a wagon waiting. The ranch is about an hour north of town. We can stop for lunch if you would like." "I would prefer to see the house, if that is acceptable." "Of course." The ride north was quiet. Miriam sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the landscape rolling past. Russell tried several times to make conversation, pointing out landmarks, but her responses were brief and polite. Nothing more. He began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake, if she was regretting her decision already. As they crested a small rise, his land spread out before them. The house sat in a shallow valley, with the creek running along the western edge and the prairie stretching endlessly to the east and north. It was not much, but it was his, and Russell felt a swell of pride despite his nervousness. "There it is," he said. "It is not fancy, but it is solid. I built it myself." Miriam said nothing for a long moment, then she turned to him, and he saw something shift in her expression. "You built this yourself?" "Yes, madam. Took 2 years, working when I could. The walls are thick and the roof does not leak. It stays warm in winter." "It is more than I expected." Her voice was quiet, almost wondering. Russell helped her down from the wagon, his hands careful on her waist. She was so small, so delicate, and he was suddenly terrified of breaking her. She walked slowly toward the house, and he followed, carrying her bag. Inside, she set her bonnet on the table and looked around. Her gaze traveled over the rough curtains, the scrubbed floors, the new bed visible through the open bedroom door. She walked to the window and looked out at the prairie, her fingers touching the glass lightly. "The wildflowers," she said suddenly. "You mentioned them in your letters. When do they bloom?" "They have started already," Russell said, eager to please. "Though the best display is usually in June and July. There are lupines and Indian paintbrush, sunflowers and evening primrose. They cover the whole prairie in color. I would like to see them. We can walk out after you have rested." She turned to face him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, tentative thing, but it transformed her face. "I would like that very much." They were married the next morning by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Pueblo. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, conducted in the small church with only Danny Wheeler and the preacher's wife as witnesses. Miriam wore the same gray dress she had arrived in. Russell had bought her a simple gold band in town that morning, and when he slipped it onto her finger, his hand shook slightly. That night, back at the house, they moved around each other with careful politeness. Russell heated water for her to wash, then stepped outside to give her privacy. When he came back in, she had changed into a nightgown and was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair loose around her shoulders. It fell nearly to her waist, dark and thick, and Russell found himself staring. "I know this is not a conventional marriage," Miriam said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "I know we are strangers." "Yes, madam. I would like to take time, if that is acceptable to you, to become acquainted before we are truly husband and wife." Relief flooded through Russell. He had been dreading this moment, terrified of frightening her. "I would like that too. I will sleep out here in the main room. You take the bed." She looked up at him, surprise clear on her face. "You would do that, for as long as you need." That night, Russell lay on the floor wrapped in blankets, listening to the soft sounds of Miriam breathing in the next room. He had never felt more aware of another person's presence in his life. Over the following days, they began to establish a routine. Russell woke before dawn and did the necessary work around the property, tending to the horses, checking the fences he had built, working on the small barn he was constructing. Miriam kept the house, cooked their meals, and washed their clothes in the creek. She was efficient and capable, wasting no motion, and Russell realized that her years in the mill had taught her how to work hard. But there was a distance between them, a wall of politeness that neither seemed able to breach. They spoke of practical matters, the weather, supplies needed from town, but nothing deeper. At meals, they sat across from each other in near silence. At night, Russell slept on the floor and Miriam closed the bedroom door. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Russell came in from working on the barn to find Miriam standing at the window, tears streaming down her face. She tried to turn away when she heard him, but he had already seen. "Miriam, what is wrong?" "Nothing. I am fine." "You are crying." She wiped at her face roughly. "I said I am fine." Russell stood uncertainly in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "If I have done something to upset you, I apologize. You have done nothing wrong." Her voice broke on the last word. "You have been nothing but kind and respectful." "That is not the problem." "Then what is?" She turned to face him, her eyes red. "I am lonely. I am so terribly lonely. Back in Massachusetts I had friends, people I knew. Here I have nothing, I know no one. I spend all day in this house with only my own thoughts for company, and I feel like I am disappearing." Russell felt like he had been punched in the gut. He had been so focused on giving her space, on being respectful, that he had not realized he was isolating her. "I am sorry. I did not think." "How could you know? I chose this. I knew what I was agreeing to when I came here." "That does not mean you have to be miserable." He took a step closer. "Tomorrow is Saturday. We will go into town. I will introduce you to people. There are other women in Pueblo families. You need friends." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking. I am offering." He paused. "And maybe we could talk more, get to know each other. That is what you wanted, is it not?" She nodded, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. "Yes." "Then that is what we will do." The next day, they rode into Pueblo together. Russell introduced Miriam to everyone they encountered. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, invited Miriam to the ladies' sewing circle that met every Thursday. Sarah Chen, whose family ran a restaurant on Main Street, suggested they come for dinner sometime. By the time they left town, Miriam looked brighter than Russell had seen her since her arrival. On the ride home, she was more talkative, asking him about the people they had met, about the town's history. Russell found himself opening up, telling her about his own past. He had come to Colorado from Kansas 7 years ago, alone and nearly broke. He had worked whatever jobs he could find, saved every penny, and slowly built a life for himself. He talked about his dreams for the ranch, his plans to expand, to raise cattle and horses. "You have accomplished so much on your own," Miriam said. "You should be proud." "I am. But it is not much of a life without someone to share it with. That is why I wrote to the agency." "I wondered about that. You do not seem like the kind of man who would need to send away for a wife." Russell felt his face heat. "I am not good with people. I never know what to say." And the women in town, they want men who can dance and make pretty speeches. That is not me. I do not care about dancing or pretty speeches, Miriam said quietly. I care about honesty and kindness. You have given me both. That night, Russell slept on the floor again, but the silence between them felt different, less like a wall and more like a comfortable quiet. As May turned into June, the wildflowers began to bloom in earnest. The prairie transformed into a riot of color, exactly as Russell had described in his letters. Purple lupines nodded in the breeze, scarlet paintbrush dotted the hillsides, and golden sunflowers turned their faces to the sun. Miriam was enchanted. Every morning after breakfast, she would walk out into the prairie, sometimes for hours, wandering among the flowers. She would return with armfuls of blooms, arranging them in jars and bowls throughout the house. The simple dwelling took on new life, filled with color and the sweet scent of growing things. Russell watched her during these walks, saw the joy that lit her face when she discovered a new variety of flower, the way she knelt in the grass to examine them closely. An idea began to form in his mind. He started to work on it in secret, in the early mornings before Miriam woke and in the evenings after she went to bed. There was a section of land just east of the house, about 2 acres, flat and fertile. Russell began to prepare the soil, breaking it up, removing rocks, working in compost. It was back-breaking labor, and he had to be careful to do it when Miriam was occupied elsewhere. Danny Wheeler rode out one afternoon and found Russell working in the field, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool June air. "What in blazes are you doing?" Danny asked, dismounting. "Preparing a field. I can see that." "For what?" Russell leaned on his shovel. "Wildflowers for Miriam." Danny stared at him. "You are planting a field of wildflowers. Russell, you can just walk 100 feet in any direction and find wildflowers. Those are wild, these will be hers." "Something I grew for her." Danny shook his head, grinning. "You have got it bad, friend. I do not know what you mean. You are in love with your own wife. Most men would not consider that a problem, but you look miserable about it." Russell wiped sweat from his forehead. "She is only here because she had nowhere else to go. She does not feel that way about me." "How do you know?" "She still will not share a room with me." "Did you ask her?" "Of course not. She said she needed time and I am giving it to her." Danny sighed. "Russell, you are a good man, but you are thick as a post sometimes. Talk to her. Tell her how you feel. And if she does not feel the same, then what? She is stuck here with me, married, with no way out. I will not put that burden on her. So instead you will just pine away in silence while planting her a field of flowers. Very noble. Just help me or leave me alone." Danny helped, and between the two of them they finished preparing the soil within a week. Then came the tricky part, acquiring the seeds. Russell rode into Pueblo and spoke with Mrs. Patterson at the general store, explaining what he needed. She was delighted by the romantic gesture and helped him order seeds from a supplier in Denver. It took another 2 weeks for them to arrive, during which Russell fretted that Miriam would discover the prepared field and ask questions. But Miriam was occupied with her own pursuits. She had attended the sewing circle and made friends with several of the women, particularly Sarah Chen, and a young woman named Elizabeth Morrison, whose husband owned a small farm south of town. Elizabeth was teaching Miriam how to make butter and cheese, skills that Miriam threw herself into with determined enthusiasm. Russell loved watching her bloom, just like the wildflowers she adored. She smiled more often, laughed at things he said. The distance between them was closing, slowly but surely. One evening in late June, Miriam surprised him by suggesting they eat dinner outside. She had prepared a picnic of sorts, with cold chicken and fresh bread and the butter she had made herself. They sat on a blanket near the creek as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I have been thinking," Miriam said, watching the water flow past. "About when I first arrived, I was so frightened." "Frightened of what, of you, of this place, of the choice I had made?" She turned to look at him. "In Massachusetts, my life was hard but predictable. I worked in the mill 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The noise was deafening, the air full of lint that made it hard to breathe. I lived in a boarding house with 8 other girls, all of us crammed into 2 rooms. We had no privacy, no peace, no hope of anything better. When my friend Martha told me about the mail-order bride agencies, it seemed like a fairy tale, a way out. But you were not sure if it would be better or worse," Russell said quietly. "Exactly. I did not know if I would be jumping from one prison into another. I had heard stories about men who wanted servants, not wives, men who were cruel." She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers light on his. "You have been nothing like that. You have given me freedom I never had before. Space to breathe, time to find myself again. I am grateful." Russell turned his hand over, catching her fingers gently. "I do not want your gratitude, Miriam." "What do you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Russell knew this was the moment, the one Danny had told him to seize. But the words stuck in his throat, too big and too fragile at once. "I want you to be happy," he finally said. "That is all." Miriam studied his face in the fading light, and Russell thought he saw a disappointment flicker across her features, but it was gone too quickly for him to be sure. "I am getting there," she said softly and withdrew her hand. That night, Russell lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling, calling himself every kind of coward. The seeds arrived the first week of July, and Russell began planting immediately. He worked in the early morning hours, using a technique Mrs. Patterson had recommended, mixing the seeds with sand so he could spread them more evenly. There were dozens of varieties: lupines and columbines, wild roses and asters, poppies and black-eyed Susans. Some would bloom this summer, others not until next year, but eventually, if Russell tended them properly, the field would be a constantly changing tapestry of color. He was so focused on his work that he did not hear Miriam approach until she spoke. "What are you doing?" Russell jerked upright, nearly dropping the bag of seeds. Miriam stood at the edge of the field, her hair in a braid over her shoulder, wearing the simple work dress she favored. She was looking at the prepared earth, at the small flags he had placed to mark where he had already sown seeds, at the diagram he had drawn on a piece of paper weighted down with a rock. "I was planting," Russell said, his voice rough. "So much for the surprise." "Planting what?" "Wildflowers." "For you." Miriam walked closer, her eyes wide. "For me. You said you loved them. I thought if you had your own field you would not have to walk so far to find them, and you could plant whatever varieties you wanted, not just what grows wild. You prepared all this soil yourself." "Danny helped some." "How long have you been working on this?" "Few weeks." Miriam looked at the field, at the careful preparation, the neat rows he had planned. Her hand came up to her mouth, and when she turned to face him, her eyes were wet with tears. "No one has ever done anything like this for me." Russell felt panic rising. "I did not mean to make you cry. If you do not like it, I can plant something else, something useful like wheat or vegetables. Do not you dare." She closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around him. "This is the kindest, most wonderful thing anyone has ever done for me." Russell stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arms around her. She fit perfectly against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin. She was warm and solid and real, and she smelled like the lavender soap she used and the wild roses she had picked yesterday. "I wanted you to have something beautiful," he said into her hair. "Something that was just yours." Miriam pulled back enough to look up at him. Her face was tear-streaked but radiant. "You are a remarkable man, Russell Lawton. I am not. I am just a cowhand with some land and too many feelings I do not know what to do with." "What feelings?" Again the moment. Again the choice. Russell looked down at Miriam, at her green eyes and hopeful expression, and found his courage. "I am in love with you," he said simply. "I think I have been since your first letter when you told me about the wildflowers. I know this marriage was supposed to be practical, a business arrangement. I know you do not feel the same way, but I needed you to know. I will not press you or make demands. Nothing has to change, but I could not keep it secret anymore." Miriam stared at him, her lips parted in surprise. "You think I do not feel the same way? I know you do not. You still will not even share a room with me. Because I was terrified that if I did, you would realize what a fraud I am." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I am not brave or strong. I am just a scared girl from Massachusetts who ran away to Colorado because she could not face another day in that mill. I did not know how to be a wife, how to be what you needed. I thought if I kept some distance, you would not see how inadequate I am." Inadequate. "Miriam, you are the strongest person I have ever met. You left everything you knew and came halfway across the country to marry a stranger. You have built a life here from nothing. You run this household like you were born to it. You are brave and capable and so beautiful it hurts to look at you sometimes. You think I am beautiful. How could you doubt it? Because you never said anything. You never even tried to kiss me. Because you asked for time and I was trying to be respectful." Miriam laughed, the sound bright and clear. "We are quite a pair, are we not? Both of us in love and both too frightened to say so. You love me." "Yes, you foolish man. I have loved you since the day you told me you built this house yourself. I have loved you since you introduced me to everyone in town so I would not be lonely. I have loved you since I realized you were sleeping on the floor to make me comfortable." She reached up and touched his face, her palm against his cheek. "I love you, Russell." He kissed her then, bending down to capture her lips with his. She rose up on her toes to meet him, her arms around his neck. The kiss was sweet and careful at first, then deeper as confidence grew. Russell's hands spanned her waist, and he lifted her clear off the ground. Miriam laughed against his mouth and he set her down gently, reluctant to break contact. "Well," Miriam said breathlessly, "that was worth waiting for. We have wasted so much time. Then let us not waste any more." She took his hand and tugged him toward the house. "Come on." "What about the seeds? I should finish planting." "The seeds can wait." "I cannot." Russell let himself be led, his heart soaring. That night Miriam did not close the bedroom door. Russell joined her in the bed they would now share, and they came together with a tenderness born of weeks of longing and restraint. They were nervous and fumbling at first, both inexperienced, but what they lacked in skill they made up for in feeling. Afterward they lay tangled together, Miriam's head on Russell's chest, his fingers stroking through her hair. "I cannot believe we were both so foolish," Miriam murmured. "I think we were both trying to protect ourselves. And each other. That too." Russell pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But no more secrets. No more holding back." "Agreed. Agreed." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and Russell thought he had never been happier in his life. Over the following weeks, their relationship transformed. The shyness and formality that had defined their early interactions vanished, replaced by an easy intimacy. They talked endlessly, learning each other's histories, dreams, fears. Miriam told him about growing up in an orphanage, about the books she loved to read, about her secret dream of someday having a garden and a home of her own. Russell shared his own childhood, the parents he had lost to fever when he was 16, the years of drifting before he found his purpose in Colorado. They worked together on the wildflower field, Russell teaching Miriam the basics of gardening, Miriam bringing a naturalist's eye to the placement of different species. They planned for blooms that would complement each other, for waves of color that would progress through the seasons. In late July, the first of the quick-growing flowers began to bloom. Poppies unfurled their papery petals in shades of orange and yellow. Black-eyed Susans nodded in the breeze. It was nowhere near the full vision Russell had planned, but it was a start, and Miriam was ecstatic. She spent hours in the field, tending the young plants, watering them when the summer heat grew too intense. Russell watched her from the barn he was building, saw the joy in every line of her body, and knew he had made the right choice. One afternoon in early August, Sarah Chen and Elizabeth Morrison rode out to visit. Miriam served them lemonade on the porch, and Russell excused himself to give them privacy. But he could hear their laughter and animated conversation from where he was working. That evening, Miriam was practically glowing. "Sarah and Elizabeth want us to come to a dance next week. It is the annual harvest celebration in town. Everyone will be there." A dance. Russell felt his stomach sink. "Miriam, I told you I do not dance. You could learn." "I would just embarrass you. You could never embarrass me." She moved closer, putting her arms around his waist. "But if you truly do not want to go, we will stay home. I just thought it might be nice to celebrate with the community." Russell looked down at her hopeful face and felt his resistance crumble. "I will make a fool of myself. Then we will be fools together." The night of the dance, Russell put on his good shirt and the new string tie Miriam had bought him in town. She wore a dress that Elizabeth had helped her sew, a simple blue cotton that matched her eyes and brought out the roses in her cheeks. She had pinned her hair up, and Russell thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The dance was held in the largest barn in Pueblo, with lanterns strung from the rafters and a small group of musicians playing fiddles and guitars. It seemed like the whole town had turned out. Russell knew he should have expected it, but the crowd made him nervous. "We do not have to stay long," Miriam said, reading his discomfort. "We will stay as long as you want." They greeted friends, and Russell endured good-natured ribbing from Danny and the other ranch hands. Mrs. Patterson insisted on being introduced to Miriam properly, even though they had met several times before, and pronounced her a perfect match for Russell. Sarah Chen dragged them over to meet her parents, who ran the restaurant and insisted they must come for dinner soon. Then the music started in earnest, and couples began to move onto the dance floor. Miriam looked at Russell expectantly. "I am going to step on your feet," he warned. "I will survive." On the dance floor, Russell was every bit as clumsy as he had predicted. He was too aware of his big hands on Miriam's waist, his heavy boots that seemed determined to find her toes. But Miriam just laughed and guided him through the steps, patient and encouraging. By the third song, he was starting to get the hang of it, and by the fifth, he was almost enjoying himself. "See," Miriam said, looking up at him, "you are doing fine. I have a good teacher." They danced until Russell's feet ached, then retreated to the edge of the barn to catch their breath. Danny appeared with cups of punch, and they stood together, watching the other couples whirl past. "You two look happy," Danny observed. "We are," Russell said, pulling Miriam close against his side. "Good. You deserve it, both of you." The dance lasted until well past midnight, and when they finally rode home, Miriam was practically asleep against Russell's shoulder. He carried her inside and helped her out of her dress, then tucked her into bed. She pulled him down beside her, murmuring sleepily about how wonderful the evening had been, how lucky she was. Russell lay awake for a while, listening to her breathe, marveling at the turn his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been alone, convinced he always would be. Now he had Miriam, had love, had a future that stretched bright and promising before them. As summer faded into fall, the wildflower field began to die back, but not before producing a spectacular show of late-season blooms. The asters came in, great clouds of purple and pink, and the goldenrod turned whole sections of the field yellow as butter. Miriam harvested seeds from the dying flowers, carefully labeling and storing them for next year's planting. "We can expand the field," she said one evening, sitting at the table with her collection of seed packets spread before her. "Add another acre, maybe two. I would love to try some of the native grasses too, create a real prairie meadow." "Whatever you want," Russell said. "This is your project." "Our project. I could not do any of this without you." In late September, Miriam realized she was with child. She told Russell one morning over breakfast, her face a mixture of joy and nervousness. "Are you happy?" she asked, watching his reaction carefully. Russell came around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Happy does not begin to cover it. Miriam, you have given me everything I ever wanted. A home, love, and now a family. I am the luckiest man in Colorado." "I am frightened," she admitted. "I do not know anything about being a mother. We will figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else." They spent the winter preparing. Russell built a cradle from oak, carefully sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk. Miriam sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her friends from town arriving regularly with gifts and advice. Elizabeth, who had 3 children of her own, was a particular help, walking Miriam through what to expect, easing her fears. The wildflower field lay dormant under snow, but Russell and Miriam pored over seed catalogs in the evenings, planning expansions, discussing new varieties to try. They had become true partners in the project, Miriam's vision and Russell's labor combining to create something neither could have achieved alone. In March of 1883, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of green appeared on the prairie, Miriam went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth, and there were moments when Russell thought he might lose his mind from worry. But Elizabeth was there, calm and competent, and just after dawn on a cold spring morning, Russell's son was born. They named him Thomas after Russell's father. He was small and red-faced and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Russell held him with shaking hands, terrified and overwhelmed and more in love than he thought possible. "He is beautiful," Russell whispered. "He is perfect," Miriam agreed, exhausted but radiant. Our little wildflower. The first weeks were hard, filled with sleepless nights and the constant needs of an infant. But they navigated it together, Russell helping when he could, taking Thomas in the early mornings so Miriam could rest. Danny and the other ranch hands took up the slack with Russell's work at the Double K, giving him time to be with his family. When spring arrived in earnest, the wildflower field erupted in color. The perennials they had planted the previous year returned, stronger and more vigorous. The field was still young, still finding its rhythm, but it was glorious nonetheless. Miriam would take Thomas out in the mornings, walking slowly through the flowers, pointing out the different colors and varieties as if he could understand. Russell would watch them from the porch, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. This life they had built together, this family, this home, it was more than he had ever dreamed possible. One evening in May, almost exactly a year since Miriam's arrival, they sat together on the porch as the sun set. Thomas was asleep in Miriam's arms, and the wildflower field swayed gently in the breeze, a sea of color stretching toward the horizon. "You ever regret it?" Russell asked. "Leaving Massachusetts, coming here to marry a stranger?" Miriam looked at him, surprise clear on her face. "Never, not once. Do you regret sending that letter, marrying you, having all this?" He gestured to encompass the house, the field, their son. How could I? Then why ask? Because sometimes I still cannot believe it is real, that you are real, that you chose me. You chose me too, Miriam reminded him. You could have married any number of women, but you read my letters and decided I was worth the risk. Best decision I ever made. Mine too. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors fade from the sky. In the field, fireflies began to emerge, their lights blinking in the gathering darkness like earthbound stars. I want to expand the field, Miriam said eventually. Add at least 3 more acres. Create different sections with different themes. A butterfly garden, a cutting garden, a section just for native plants. That is a lot of work, I know, but I have time now, and I have you to help me. She shifted Thomas carefully, leaning against Russell's shoulder. This field, this thing we built together, I want it to grow. I want Thomas to grow up running through flowers. I want it to be our legacy. Then that is what we will do. Over the following years, they expanded the field exactly as Miriam envisioned. Russell helped her break new ground each spring, and together they planted seeds, tended seedlings, and nurtured the growing garden. The field became famous in the region, people riding out from Pueblo just to see the wildflowers that the cowboy had planted for his mail-order bride. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious child who loved nothing more than helping his mother in the garden. He learned the names of every flower, could identify them by leaf and stem, even before they bloomed. In 1885, Miriam gave birth to a daughter, Clara, who inherited her father's dark hair and serious expression. And in 1888, another son arrived, Daniel, named for Danny Wheeler, who had become like family. Russell continued to work the land, expanding his holdings slowly and carefully. He bought cattle and horses, built barns and fences, and established a reputation as a fair and honest rancher. But he never forgot that his greatest achievement was the wildflower field he had planted for his wife. The field itself became a living thing, changing with the seasons and years. Some plants flourished and spread, others struggled and died out. Miriam experimented constantly, trying new species, new combinations, new techniques. She corresponded with botanists and horticulturists, trading seeds and knowledge. She kept meticulous records, documenting what grew where, what bloomed when, creating a library of information that she passed on to her children. Every year on the anniversary of Miriam's arrival, they would walk through the field together, just the two of them, leaving the children with Elizabeth or Sarah. They would remember that first uncertain year, the walls they had built and then torn down, the love they had been too frightened to name. "Do you remember how scared I was that first day?" Miriam asked one May afternoon when the field was at its peak, a riot of color and life. They were older now, both in their 30s, weathered by sun and work but still strong. "I remember how scared I was," Russell countered. "Terrified I had made a mistake, that you would take one look at me and want to leave. Instead, I took one look at you and fell in love. Liar. You did not fall in love until I started building you this field. No, I fell in love when you introduced me to everyone in town so I would not be lonely. The field just sealed the deal." Russell pulled her close, kissing her temple. 20 years we have been together. 20 years, and I still wake up every morning amazed that you are here, that you are mine. "Ours," Miriam corrected. "We belong to each other." "Yes, we do." They stood together, surrounded by flowers, the house they had built visible in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where their children were probably starting to think about dinner. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and a gentle wind rustled through the flowers, carrying their sweet scent. "I want to add another section," Miriam said eventually. "For roses, climbing roses on trellises, creating a kind of outdoor room within the field. Roses are not wildflowers. No, but they are beautiful. And this stopped being just a wildflower field years ago. It is a garden now, our garden, and it can be whatever we want it to be. Then roses it is. Russell smiled down at his wife, at the woman who had arrived on a train 16 years ago with nothing but a carpet bag and a dream of wildflowers. She had transformed his life, filled it with color and beauty and love, and he would spend the rest of his days making sure she never regretted her choice. "I love you," he said, the words as easy now as breathing. "I love you too," Miriam replied, "more than all the flowers in this field." "That is a lot of flowers. That is a lot of love." They walked back to the house hand in hand as the last light faded from the sky. Behind them, the wildflower field rustled and swayed, a testament to the love of a cowboy and his mail-order bride, to the life they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work, and a shared dream of beauty growing wild under the Colorado sky. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. The children grew, and Russell and Miriam grew with them, adapting to each new stage of parenthood. Thomas, their eldest, developed his mother's love of plants and his father's practical nature. By the time he was 15, he was managing whole sections of the field himself, experimenting with hybridization and selective breeding. Clara, their daughter, was quieter and more studious. She loved to read, and would often sit in the middle of the field with a book, surrounded by flowers, lost in whatever world the pages conjured. Russell built her a small gazebo in the center of the garden when she was 12, a place where she could read in the shade and watch the butterflies dance among the blooms. Daniel, the youngest, was the wild one. He had no patience for gardening, preferring to ride horses and help his father with the cattle. But he loved the field in his own way, racing through it at full speed, whooping and hollering, scattering birds and butterflies in his wake. Miriam would scold him, but Russell would just laugh. The field was meant to bring joy, and Daniel's joy was loud and energetic. In 1895, when Thomas was 22 and starting to think about settling down himself, he met a girl in town, the daughter of a banker. She was educated and refined, and Russell worried she would not understand their family's simple ways. But when Thomas brought her to meet them, and she saw the wildflower field for the first time, she burst into tears of pure delight. "I have never seen anything so beautiful," she breathed, walking slowly between the rows of flowers. "It is like something from a dream." Miriam and Russell exchanged glances, remembering another girl who had dreamed of wildflowers, and they welcomed her into their family with open arms. The field continued to expand and evolve. By 1900, it covered nearly 10 acres, a sprawling tapestry of cultivated beauty that drew visitors from as far away as Denver and Santa Fe. Miriam had added the roses she wanted, along with a water feature that Russell built, complete with a small pond where dragonflies skimmed the surface and frogs sang at night. People would sometimes ask Russell why he spent so much time and effort on something that did not generate income, that was purely decorative. He would smile and say that some things were worth more than money, that the look on Miriam's face when she walked through the flowers was payment enough. But the field did bring rewards, unexpected ones. A photographer from New York came to capture images of the garden and publish them in a national magazine. A seed company approached Miriam about developing a line of regional wildflower mixes, offering her a partnership and royalties. She accepted, and suddenly the wildflower field was not just beautiful but profitable as well. "We should expand the ranch," Russell said one evening after Miriam had signed the contract with the seed company. "Buy the Henderson property to the north. We can afford it now and the land is good." But Miriam shook her head. "I do not want to expand the ranch, I want to expand the field. Make it something truly special, something that will last long after we are gone." "What do you have in mind?" "A public garden. Something people can visit, walk through, enjoy. We could have paths and benches, educational signs about the different plants. We could host school groups, teach children about native plants and conservation." Russell considered this. They were in their 50s now, not old but not young either. Their children were grown or nearly so. The ranch was successful enough to support them comfortably. Why not spend their later years creating something beautiful for everyone to enjoy? "All right," he said. "Let us do it." They spent the next 5 years transforming the Wildflower field into a true public garden. Russell built paths of crushed gravel winding through the different sections. They installed benches at scenic spots, each one dedicated to a friend or family member who had been part of their journey. Sarah Chen and Elizabeth Morrison, who were still close friends after all these years, received the first 2 benches, placed side by side in the rose garden. Miriam created educational materials, drawing on her decades of experience and her extensive correspondence with botanists. She hired a local artist to create beautiful illustrated signs identifying the plants, explaining their uses and significance. She established a small library in a converted-out building filled with books about plants, gardening, and natural history. The garden officially opened to the public in the spring of 1905. It was a beautiful April day, warm and clear, with the early spring flowers already blooming. Half the town of Pueblo turned out for the dedication ceremony, along with visitors from across Colorado and beyond. Miriam stood before the gathered crowd, Russell at her side, and spoke about the garden's origins. She told them about arriving in Colorado as a frightened mail-order bride, about dreaming of wildflowers, about the cowboy who had planted a field just to make her smile. There was not a dry eye in the audience by the time she finished. "This garden is our gift to all of you," she concluded. "A place of beauty and peace, where anyone can come to remember that there is still wonder in the world. We hope it brings you as much joy as it has brought us." The applause was thunderous, and as people began to disperse into the garden, exploring the paths and exclaiming over the flowers, Russell pulled Miriam into his arms. "We did it," he said softly. "We built something that will outlast us." "We did," Miriam agreed, her eyes bright with tears. And it all started with a letter and a dream. Over the following years, the garden became a beloved regional attraction. Thousands of people visited each season, walking the paths, sitting on the benches, marveling at the carefully cultivated beauty. School groups came regularly, children running excitedly from flower to flower. Notebooks in hand as they sketched and learned, Russell and Miriam became fixtures at the garden, the old couple who could always be found working among the flowers or chatting with visitors. They answered questions, gave advice, and shared the story of how the garden came to be. People were enchanted by their love story, by the romantic gesture that had grown into something so much larger. Thomas took over the day-to-day management of the ranch, though Russell still helped when his aging body allowed. Clara, who had married a professor from Colorado College, returned to Pueblo regularly to help her mother with the garden's educational programs. Daniel, who had become a horse breeder of some renown, lived on the property with his own growing family and helped maintain the garden's infrastructure. In 1912, on a warm June afternoon, Russell and Miriam celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a party in the garden. All their children and grandchildren were there, along with friends old and new. Danny Wheeler, now gray-haired but still spry, gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. 30 years ago, I told Russell he was crazy for planting a field of wildflowers, Danny said, raising his glass. I told him he had it bad, falling in love with his own wife. Well, I was right about one thing. He did have it bad, but he was not crazy. He was the smartest man I knew, because he understood something the rest of us did not. Love is not just a feeling. It is an action. It is waking up every day and choosing to plant flowers, to build a life, to create beauty together. Russell and Miriam, you have shown us all what love can be when it is tended and nurtured like the flowers in this garden. Here is to 30 more years. Everyone drank, and Russell looked at Miriam, seeing not the gray hair and lined face, but the young woman who had stepped off the train so many years ago, frightened and brave and dreaming of wildflowers. I would do it all again, he said, only loud enough for her to hear. Every single day. I know, Miriam replied, squeezing his hand. So would I. They did not get 30 more years. In the winter of 1918, Russell fell ill with pneumonia. He fought it for 3 weeks, Miriam at his bedside the entire time, but in the end his worn-out body could not recover. He died on a cold January morning, with Miriam holding his hand, and their children gathered around. The entire town turned out for the funeral. The church could not hold everyone who wanted to pay their respects to the cowboy, who had planted a field of wildflowers for his bride. They buried Russell on a hill overlooking the garden, in a spot he had chosen years before, where he could watch the flowers bloom for eternity. Miriam was devastated. For weeks, she barely left the house, her grief so profound that her children worried she might not recover. But as winter faded and spring approached, she slowly returned to herself. The garden needed her, and she needed the garden. She threw herself into the work with renewed energy, expanding the collection, improving the paths, writing a comprehensive guidebook. It was her way of honoring Russell, of keeping his memory alive through the thing they had built together. The garden is his legacy, she told Clara one afternoon, as they worked side by side planting new perennials. Every flower, every path, every bench, he is here in every bit of it. It is your legacy too, Mother. Ours, Miriam corrected, echoing words she had spoken so many times to Russell. It was always ours. Miriam lived another 15 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1933 at the age of 73. She was buried beside Russell on the hill, under a headstone that read simply, "Together, they planted beauty." The garden passed to their children, who maintained it lovingly, and then to their grandchildren, who expanded and improved it further. As the decades rolled past and the world changed around it, the wildflower garden remained, a constant reminder of the power of love and the beauty that can grow from a single generous act. By the turn of the 21st century, the garden had grown to encompass 25 acres and attracted tens of thousands of visitors each year. The original house that Russell built still stood, preserved as a museum, telling the story of the mail-order bride and the cowboy who loved her. The letters they had written during their courtship were on display, along with Miriam's seed catalogs and Russell's hand-drawn plans for the garden. On the wall of the museum hung a photograph, faded and yellowed with age. It showed a young couple standing in a field of wildflowers, the woman small and dark-haired, the man tall and sun-weathered. They were holding hands, looking not at the camera but at each other, and the love in their eyes was evident even across the years. Beneath the photograph, a plaque told their story. It spoke of a lonely cowboy and a brave young woman, of letters and hopes and dreams of wildflowers. It told how Russell had planted a field just to make Miriam smile, and how that simple act of love had grown into something that brought joy to countless thousands. Visitors would read the plaque and look at the photograph, and then they would walk out into the garden, following the paths that Russell had built and admiring the flowers that Miriam had chosen. They would sit on benches in the shade and breathe in the sweet scent of roses and wildflowers. And for a moment, they would be part of the love story too, part of the legacy of beauty that the cowboy and his mail-order bride had planted together so long ago. And in the spring, when the wildflowers bloomed in waves of purple and gold, orange and pink, visitors walking through the garden swore they could hear laughter on the wind, see shadows moving between the flowers, two figures walking hand in hand through the beauty they had created, together for eternity in the field of wildflowers that had started it all. The garden became a destination for couples, especially those newly engaged or recently married. It became tradition to have wedding photographs taken among the flowers, to exchange vows in the rose garden where Russell had built Miriam her outdoor room. The garden became synonymous with enduring love, with partnership, with the beauty that could be created when two people chose to build something together. Each generation of the family added their own touches while respecting the original vision. In the 1950s, Russell and Miriam's great-granddaughter established a conservation program, protecting rare native species. In the 1970s, another descendant created a sustainable gardening initiative, teaching organic techniques and water conservation. Through it all, the wildflowers remained, blooming faithfully year after year, a living testament to a love that had begun with a letter and a leap of faith. The story of Russell and Miriam became part of Colorado folklore, told and retold with each generation. School children learned about them in history class, about the mail-order bride who had dreamed of wildflowers and the cowboy who had made her dreams come true. Their story was a reminder that love could bloom anywhere, that beauty could be cultivated even in the harshest conditions, and that the greatest legacies were not measured in wealth or power, but in the joy and beauty we leave behind for others to enjoy. And so the garden continued, season after season, year after year, century after century, always blooming, always beautiful, always telling the story of two people who had found each other against the odds and had chosen to build something extraordinary together. A cowboy and his mail-order bride, their love immortalized in petals and leaves, in paths and benches, in the thousands of visitors who walked through the gates each year looking for beauty and finding, along with the flowers, a story of hope and love that would never fade.